At 57, Barry Sanders is still spoken about with a kind of reverence that few athletes ever achieve. Not because he chased attention, not because he demanded admiration, but because he walked away from the very thing that defined him at the exact moment the world wanted more. For an entire generation of football fans, Barry Sanders was not just a running back. He was an experience. Every carry felt unpredictable. Every cut defied physics. Defenders lunged, grasped at air, and fell behind him, often without understanding how they got there. He ran with power without arrogance, brilliance without noise. And when he scored, he simply handed the ball to the referee and jogged back to the sideline. Greatness, to him, never required an announcement. Yet beneath that quiet excellence, something far less visible was taking shape. By the late 1990s, Sanders had already accomplished what most players only dream of: MVP honors, multiple rushing titles, record-breaking seasons. He had become a Detroit Lions' entire offensive identity. Every defense game plan for him. Every fan believed that as long as Barry was on the field, hope still existed. But hope can be heavy when you are the one carrying it alone. What the public did not see was the toll of years spent absorbing punishment without complaint. The hits that came after the whistle. The plays where blockers failed and Sanders absorbed the impact anyway. The expectation that he would create something out of nothing, week after week, season after season. And perhaps most exhausting of all, the silence. Barry Sanders was never the loudest voice in the room. He did not lobby management. He did not publicly criticize teammates or coaches. He internalized frustration. He showed up, he performed, and he went home. Over time, that quiet endurance began to feel less like professionalism and more like isolation. In 1999, with 10 straight Pro Bowl seasons behind him and history within reach, Sanders made a decision that shocked the sports world. He retired. No warning, no build-up, no farewell tour. Just a brief statement in an empty locker. Fans were stunned. Analysts were furious. Commentators called it selfish. Others accused him of quitting on the team, the city, the game itself. How could someone walk away with so much left to give? But that question missed the point entirely. Barry Sanders did not leave because he had nothing left to accomplish. He left because he understood something many athletes learned too late. Success does not protect you from emptiness, and chasing milestones does not guarantee fulfillment. Years later, in rare interviews, Sanders would gently pull back the curtain. He spoke of losing joy, of football becoming obligation rather than passion, of Sundays that felt heavier than they should. There was no scandal behind his departure, no dramatic fallout, just emotional fatigue layered quietly over time. What makes his story tragic is not the early ending. It is the misunderstanding that followed. For years, Sanders allowed the narrative to run without correction. He absorbed criticism without rebuttal. He let others frame his choice as abandonment, even when it was clearly an act of self-preservation. In a culture that glorifies playing through pain at any cost, choosing peace can look like weakness. At 57, that choice still defines how people view him. He is celebrated, but also questioned, admired, yet never fully understood. His silence, once seen as humility, became the reason his motives were endlessly speculated about. And Barry Sanders never seemed interested in changing that. Because for him, walking away was not about legacy, it was about survival. He watched teammates struggle after retirement. He saw bodies break down, minds change, identities unravel. He recognized that football, for all its glory, takes far more than it gives. And he chose to leave while he could still recognize himself outside the game. That decision cost him records. It cost him accolades. It cost him universal approval. But it may have saved him something far more valuable. At 57, Barry Sanders stands as one of the greatest players the NFL has ever seen. Yet his true legacy may be the quiet courage to step away when the applause was loudest and accept being misunderstood in exchange for wholeness. And that is where his tragedy truly begins. After Barry Sanders stepped away from football, the noise did not fade. It intensified. The Detroit Lions moved on publicly, but the absence he left behind was impossible to ignore. Season after season, fans watched a team once built around magic struggle to replace something that could not be replicated. Sanders was not just production, he was hope. And without him, the illusion that success was just one carry away slowly disappeared. Yet Barry Sanders remained silent. While other retired stars filled television studios and opinion columns, Sanders chose distance. He did not explain himself further. He did not engage in debates about what the Lions owed him or what he owed the game. He seemed content letting the narrative remain incomplete, even if that incompleteness worked against him. That silence became its own burden. Over time, critics reframed his story. They compared him to players who chased records, who endured injuries, who sacrificed years of health for legacy. Sanders was portrayed as someone who took the easy way out. The irony, of course, was that nothing about walking away from greatness was easy. In rare public appearances, something subtle was always present. Not regret, but restraint. He spoke carefully, choosing words that revealed just enough without reopening wounds. When asked if he missed football, he often paused. And in that pause, many heard the truth more clearly than in any full answer. Because what Barry Sanders missed was not the game itself. It was the version of the game that no longer existed. The early joy, the innocence of playing without consequence, the belief that effort would be met with fairness. That version faded as business decisions replaced loyalty, and bodies became expendable assets. Sanders saw that shift clearly. He felt it in meetings, in contracts, in expectations that never aligned with support. The tragedy deepened when his story was contrasted with others. Teammates who stayed longer struggled with pain, addiction, or identity loss after retirement. Players who chased every last yard often paid for it with diminished quality of life. Sanders watched this quietly, knowing his choice spared him many of those outcomes, but also knowing it cost him the universal praise reserved for those who gave everything. At 57, Barry Sanders exists in a strange space between admiration and distance. He is honored at ceremonies, welcomed into halls of fame, and spoken of as a once-in-a-generation talent. Yet he is rarely celebrated with the emotional reverence given to those who suffered visibly. His pain was internal. His struggle was silent. And silence does not translate easily into legend. What many fans never consider is how deeply identity is tied to longevity in professional sports. To leave early is to surrender not just income or recognition, but belonging. Sanders did not just retire from football. He removed himself from the culture that had shaped him since childhood. That kind of separation leaves marks. In interviews, he often speaks about family, about balance, about life beyond the field. He seems grounded, thoughtful, and composed. But there is also a sense that part of him remains permanently disconnected from the sport that made him famous. Not out of bitterness, but necessity. Football took everything it could from Barry Sanders. What it did not take was his future. And yet, even with that preservation, the weight of public misunderstanding never fully lifted. He became a cautionary tale rather than a celebrated pioneer, a name invoked in debates about loyalty rather than well-being. His decision, once shocking, became a reference point, but rarely a fully respected one. That is the quiet heartbreak. Not that Barry Sanders retired early, but that his courage was reframed as weakness in a system that rarely rewards self-awareness. He sacrificed numbers, headlines, and approval to protect something invisible but essential. At 57, his legacy is no longer just about broken tackles and impossible runs. It is about the cost of choosing yourself in a world that demands everything, and the loneliness that can follow when you do. Because sometimes the hardest thing is not staying too long, but leaving before the damage becomes impossible to deny. Even decades after stepping away from the game, the shadow of Barry Sanders' decision still stretches long. Conversations about the NFL's greatest running backs inevitably return to his name, but rarely with full comprehension of what he gave up and what he preserved. The narrative that fans cling to is simple. Barry Sanders, the magician of the gridiron, left early. But the story beneath that headline is far more complex, far more human. After retirement, Sanders lived in a world that both celebrated and misunderstood him. He was lauded for his genius, but questioned for his absence. While many contemporaries continued to chase records, endorsements, and visibility, he quietly curated a life beyond football. Yet that quiet life came at a price. Isolation, whether chosen or imposed by circumstance, is often invisible. Few outside his immediate circle understood the loneliness of watching the sport you loved continue without you, while feeling both relief and subtle grief. Publicly, he appeared composed. He smiled for cameras. He attended charity events and spoke at schools. He shared glimpses of his life as a family man and community supporter. But the stillness behind his choices carried weight. Stepping away at the height of fame meant sacrificing applause. It meant letting the world decide your story without correction. And for Sanders, that was the ultimate trade-off. Personal peace at the expense of universal understanding. The physical toll of football is easier to measure. Injuries, surgeries, and chronic pain. But the emotional toll is subtler. Sanders had witnessed teammates endure extreme suffering, long-term injuries, and even post-career mental health struggles. The knowledge that staying longer could have led to similar fates hung over him silently. The brilliance that once dazzled stadiums now became a quiet burden, a reminder that greatness often comes with hidden costs, both seen and unseen. In the years following his retirement, Sanders also faced an evolving league. Rules changed, player expectations shifted, and the culture of football increasingly emphasized spectacle over substance. Watching the sport he had shaped evolve without him was bittersweet. He remained proud of what he had contributed, yet acutely aware of the pressures that now defined the game. His decision, made in clarity, underscored a truth few athletes dare to confront. The love of the game cannot always outweigh the love of oneself. Part of the tragedy lies in perception. Fans and analysts debated whether he quit or walked away, failing to see the courage it took to do so. The word selfish was applied liberally, ignoring the years of devotion and sacrifice that preceded his departure. In a world that often glorifies suffering for glory, choosing to preserve joy is radical and frequently misunderstood. Sanders' silence on the matter was not evasion. It was a conscious decision to prioritize integrity over public opinion. As he entered his 50s, the narrative shifted from athlete to legend, but with an undertone of melancholy. Recognition came, yes, Hall of Fame inductions, Lifetime Achievement Awards, documentaries chronicling his career, but these honors cannot erase the subtle ache of being perpetually misinterpreted. Barry Sanders' story became emblematic not only of athletic brilliance, but of the tension between personal fulfillment and public expectation. It highlighted the silent sacrifices required to protect oneself, even when the world expects total surrender. The most poignant aspect of Sanders' legacy, perhaps, is the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. He never needed to justify his choices. He never sought to explain the intricacies of his inner life to critics. Instead, he allowed his actions, his early retirement, his measured public appearances, his steadfast privacy, to speak for him. The emotional resonance of that decision is profound. He chose to live fully, even if others would never fully understand why. At 57, Barry Sanders is not defined solely by the numbers on a stat sheet. He is defined by the courage to leave on his own terms, by the foresight to protect his body and mind, and by the wisdom to recognize that even the greatest talent cannot replace personal fulfillment. And in that recognition lies both the tragedy and the triumph of his story. He preserved himself, yes, but in doing so, he left the world to grapple with a decision too profound to fit neatly into a narrative of wins and losses. Barry Sanders' journey reminds us that greatness is often measured not only in what we achieve, but in the choices we make to protect our humanity. At 57, the tragedy is not that he left football, It is that he left the applause behind, the understanding behind, and the world to admire without ever truly knowing the cost. Even now, decades removed from his career, Barry Sanders' name evokes a mixture of awe and bittersweet reflection. To watch old highlights is to witness brilliance distilled into motion, a defender lunging in vain, a stadium roaring, the ball tucked securely as Sanders seemingly defies the laws of physics. But behind that fluidity and perfection lies the quiet truth that shaped his life off the field. Stepping away at the apex of fame is never a simple act. It is an act of courage, and one that carries consequences far beyond the public eye. Retirement did not bring closure, at least not in the way fans imagined. The stadiums that once celebrated his every move remained silent to his absence, and the narrative of football greatness continued without him. Analysts speculated endlessly. Sports talk shows debated the what-ifs. Fans wondered how many more yards, touchdowns, or records could have been added to his legacy. Yet Sanders himself remained distant, steadfast in his decision. He understood that the life he preserved by leaving, the quiet moments, the time with family, the mental and physical health he could no longer afford to compromise, was worth every hypothetical accolade. The personal cost of that choice is subtle, woven into the fabric of daily life rather than dramatic headlines. He traded public acclaim for private stability. He relinquished the continuous adoration of millions in favor of peace that could not be quantified. And yet, the world continued to measure him against yardage, records, and statistics, rather than the courage it took to prioritize himself. That is the invisible heartbreak of Barry Sanders' story. He sacrificed fame in exchange for wholeness, only to be immortalized by the very metric he walked away from. For Sanders, the years that followed offered a different kind of challenge. The world expected him to speak, to advise, to share insights into a game that had been his entire life. And yet, he chose selectivity. Public appearances were rare. Media interviews were deliberate and restrained. In doing so, he maintained control over the narrative of his life, never as a spectacle, never as a performance, but as a statement that his story was his own. There is power in that silence, but also a trace of loneliness. The choice to remain private, while preserving dignity, also leaves space for misunderstanding. Few could fully grasp the internal calculus required to walk away from the game at its height. Even now, at 57, the resonance of his decision extends beyond personal consequence. Younger athletes study his highlights and marvel at the agility, vision, and instinct that made him legendary. Yet what often goes unnoticed is the lesson in autonomy he embodies. That fulfillment and happiness are not measured in yards gained or trophies collected, but in the courage to make difficult choices for oneself, even when the world does not understand. That lesson, subtle and often underappreciated, may be his greatest legacy. The tragedy, then, is both simple and profound. The world remembers Barry Sanders as a transcendent athlete, yet rarely acknowledges the cost of his wisdom. The applause, the media frenzy, the endless debates about what might have been. These are all markers of a culture that celebrates spectacle over introspection. Sanders, in choosing a quieter path, became an anomaly. He defied expectation not through flamboyance, but through deliberate absence. And in that absence, there is both sorrow and reverence. By stepping away when he did, Sanders protected not only his body, but his sense of self. He avoided the physical deterioration that haunts so many former players, and he preserved the mental clarity that allows him to reflect on his career with serenity rather than regret. Yet, even as he safeguarded his own well-being, the narrative of sacrifice and misunderstanding followed him. Critics questioned loyalty, fans speculated motives, and the media crafted what-if scenarios that disregarded the courage it took to act. And so, Barry Sanders' story at 57 is a paradox, a tale of triumph and heartbreak intertwined. He achieved the extraordinary, yet chose to leave the extraordinary behind. He gained freedom, yet forfeited universal understanding. He preserved his humanity, yet bore the weight of being perpetually misinterpreted. It is a narrative that refuses simplicity, demanding reflection, empathy, and recognition that greatness often requires choices invisible to the crowd. In the end, the tragedy of Barry Sanders is not measured in yards or accolades. It is measured in the quiet moments of courage, the unseen sacrifices, and the subtle sorrow of a life lived on one's own terms. Extraordinary, yet profoundly human. And that is the story that remains, decades after the last whistle blew, long after the stadium lights faded, and deep within the stillness of a life that chose meaning over applause. As the years pass, Barry Sanders' story grows in dimension, not just as an athlete, but as a man who understood the weight of his own choices. At 57, he stands as a living testament to the complexity of greatness. On one hand, he is remembered for dazzling runs that defied physics, for records that still spark debate, for moments of brilliance captured forever on highlight reels. On the other, he is remembered for walking away, leaving the world to interpret, misinterpret, and sometimes question his motives. That duality is at the core of the tragedy that continues to define him. In retirement, Sanders found peace, but not without cost. The stadiums no longer echoed with his name, and the crowds no longer held their collective breath as he twisted, spun, and accelerated past defenders. That absence, while liberating, carried its own quiet sorrow. The game he loved continued without him, evolving in ways he had no part in. Rules changed, offenses shifted, and the NFL landscape grew more commercialized. He watched from the periphery, witnessing the sport's evolution while preserving the private sanctuary he had created for himself. It was a sanctuary hard-won and easily misunderstood. The personal sacrifices he made for that peace are subtle but profound. By retiring early, he forfeited public validation in exchange for health, clarity, and self-respect. He chose autonomy over applause, understanding that fame without fulfillment is a hollow reward. Yet the world seldom measures greatness by the courage to step away, particularly when the expectation is that talent should be endlessly exploited. To fans and commentators, his choice sometimes appeared abrupt, even selfish. To Sanders, it was essential. It was the quiet assertion that life's worth cannot be calculated in yards gained or games won alone. Even now, the lessons of his career resonate beyond statistics. Barry Sanders exemplifies the tension between external expectation and internal truth. His story challenges the notion that achievement is defined solely by endurance or output. Instead, it emphasizes that the most courageous decisions are sometimes invisible to the public eye, decisions about boundaries, well-being, and personal values. In this way, Sanders' narrative is not only about football, it is a meditation on life itself, on the choices we make when the world is watching and when it is not. Legacy, in Sanders' case, is complex. He is lauded as one of the greatest running backs in NFL history. Yet his greatest legacy may be the demonstration of self-respect and foresight. He preserved himself when the world expected him to sacrifice everything, showing that greatness need not come at the cost of the human spirit. That lesson, quiet yet powerful, has inspired a generation of athletes to consider not only their careers, but their lives beyond the game. His silence, restraint, and discretion convey wisdom often lost amid headlines and statistics. Yet tragedy remains threaded through that wisdom. The world still debates what could have been. Analysts still calculate the yardage, the touchdowns, the records that might have fallen. Fans still wonder how much more brilliance he might have displayed. And in every discussion lies the subtle ache of absence, the realization that the most remarkable moments of a career are sometimes defined by what did not happen, by what was intentionally left on the table. Barry Sanders' life reminds us that loss and triumph are not always opposites. They are often intertwined. At 57, Barry Sanders is not merely a retired athlete. He is a symbol of the complexity of human choice. His story embodies brilliance, sacrifice, courage, and quiet sorrow. It shows that to protect one's integrity, happiness, and health sometimes requires walking away, even when the world expects otherwise. That choice is the true essence of his tragedy. It is a decision that cannot be celebrated easily, cannot be quantified, and cannot be fully understood without empathy. And yet, it is also the very decision that preserves the dignity and wholeness that many spend a lifetime seeking. In the end, the tragedy of Barry Sanders is both public and private, visible and hidden. It is the story of a man who gave everything he could to a game that demanded more, who stepped away at the peak to preserve himself, and who continues to live with the complex consequences of that choice. It is a story of brilliance and restraint, fame and solitude, applause and quiet understanding. And above all, it is a story that reminds us that true greatness is measured not only by what one achieves, but by the wisdom to know when to leave, the courage to act, and the strength to bear the world's misunderstanding with grace. Even after decades removed from the roar of stadiums, Barry Sanders' presence lingers in football culture, not just as a former athlete, but as a symbol of choice, courage, and quiet sorrow. Time has a way of softening public memory, yet Sanders' story retains a sharp edge precisely because it defies convention. He achieved what few could imagine, yet chose a path that few understood. That tension between reverence and misunderstanding defines the tragedy that follows him even at 57. Retirement did not offer closure, it offered perspective. Sanders had seen the toll football exacted on others, the chronic injuries, the relentless pressure, the gradual erosion of identity. He understood that greatness on the field often comes at the cost of personal stability, health, and mental clarity. In stepping away, he preserved what the game could never give him: the freedom to live fully, beyond the statistics, beyond the applause, beyond the world's expectations. That decision, radical in its simplicity, carried a weight that few outside his inner circle could grasp. The consequences of that choice were both subtle and profound. Sanders forfeited continuous recognition, deferred adulation, and the chance to etch his name into every statistical record imaginable. The media painted him as enigmatic, fans speculated endlessly, and commentators debated the wisdom of leaving at the height of his powers. Yet all of that pales in comparison to the courage required to prioritize oneself in a world that idolizes sacrifice without reflection. Every decision thereafter, every rare interview, every public appearance was measured against that departure. And Sanders bore it with remarkable poise. What the world often misses is the emotional complexity underlying his absence. Sanders did not leave because he lacked commitment or passion. He left because he recognized the fragile line between devotion and self-destruction. Each step on the field, each play, each game had become increasingly transactional, a performance bound by expectation rather than joy. By choosing to walk away, he reclaimed autonomy over his own life, asserting a form of greatness that cannot be quantified in yards or touchdowns. That very choice, misunderstood by many, elevates his story beyond mere athletic achievement. The years following retirement revealed both the cost and the reward of his decision. On one hand, Sanders escaped the long-term injuries and physical deterioration that plague many retired athletes. He preserved clarity, health, and a private life free from the relentless glare of professional scrutiny. On the other hand, he relinquished certain forms of recognition, championship celebrations, records, and historical milestones that only exist within the framework of persistence. His name is immortal in highlight reels, but the applause that could have accompanied each missed milestone is forever absent. That juxtaposition embodies the core of the tragedy. Triumph interwoven with sacrifice, brilliance shadowed by what was intentionally left undone. Even now, his legacy continues to resonate with young athletes. Sanders exemplifies the lesson that success is not solely about endurance, accumulation, or public validation. Sometimes the most courageous decisions are invisible, requiring foresight, self-awareness, and restraint. By choosing to walk away, he demonstrated that personal well-being can coexist with greatness, even when it contradicts conventional expectations. That subtle wisdom, more enduring than any record, is a quiet inspiration for those who will never step onto an NFL field. And yet, the tragedy is persistent. Barry Sanders' life story is measured in paradox. He is celebrated as a legend, yet perpetually misunderstood, admired for his brilliance, yet questioned for leaving early, remembered for feats that dazzled millions, yet defined by the absence that followed. That tension mirrors the very human struggle between external expectation and internal truth, a struggle that continues to echo as Sanders navigates life well beyond the stadiums that once adored him. At 57, he stands as a man who lived deliberately. He chose balance over accolades, longevity over spectacle, and personal integrity over public approval. That decision, though costly in ways the public may never fully appreciate, ensures that Sanders' life retains coherence, meaning, and dignity. He preserved himself in a world that often asks for everything and offers little in return, proving that the truest measure of greatness is not only in what is achieved, but in the wisdom to know when to step away. Ultimately, the tragedy of Barry Sanders is not merely in what he left behind on the field, but in how few truly understood what he chose to save. His story reminds us that brilliance, courage, and self-respect are often inseparable from solitude, reflection, and sacrifice. At 57, he remains both a legend and a cautionary tale, a man who dared to define greatness on his own terms, and whose quiet triumphs continue to reverberate long after the stadium lights have dimmed. Even decades after he last touched the football, Barry Sanders' presence looms large in the memory of fans, analysts, and the sport itself. His runs are still shown on highlight reels, his agility still cited in conversations about the greatest running backs in NFL history. But what makes Sanders' story enduring is not merely the feats themselves. It is the profound silence that followed his departure, the quiet aftermath that continues to define the tragedy of his career and life. After retirement, Sanders navigated a world that simultaneously revered him and misunderstood him. The cheers of the stadiums were replaced by the quiet of private life, where freedom came hand in hand with reflection. He observed the NFL from a distance, watching the evolution of a game he had helped shape while protecting his own sense of self. That distance, while restorative, carried its own weight. To watch the sport you love continue without you is a lesson in patience, humility, and a subtle, persistent sorrow that few outside his inner circle could ever fully appreciate. The public often framed his early retirement as an abrupt, even selfish decision. Analysts speculated endlessly about missed records, potential milestones, and unclaimed glory. Yet to Sanders, the choice was clear and necessary. He had seen the cost of relentless pursuit in the bodies and minds of other athletes. He recognized the diminishing returns of playing out of obligation rather than joy. And so, he stepped away, not out of weakness, but out of foresight and courage, preserving not only his physical health, but his emotional and psychological well-being. That decision, radical as it was, became the defining moment of his story. Even now, the lessons of Sanders' career extend beyond football. His story underscores the tension between external expectation and internal truth, between the applause of the crowd and the quiet satisfaction of integrity. While others chased records and validation, Sanders chose autonomy and self-preservation. That path, invisible to most, speaks volumes about the nature of greatness. Sometimes, the most extraordinary acts are the ones that go unseen, the decisions made in private, with long-term consequences that outlast fleeting recognition. The cost of his choice was subtle yet profound. He forfeited continued adulation, the opportunity to claim additional records, and the public validation that often accompanies persistence at any cost. At the same time, he gained clarity, health, and a life that could be measured by personal fulfillment rather than external metrics. He chose the path of self-respect, a route few athletes dare to consider, especially when the world demands total sacrifice for the sake of legacy. In that choice lies both the tragedy and the quiet triumph of Barry Sanders' story. Years later, Sanders' name continues to inspire new generations. Young athletes study his highlights, marvel at his agility, and emulate his creativity on the field. Yet there is an underlying lesson often overlooked. That personal boundaries, self-awareness, and the courage to make difficult choices are as integral to success as talent and hard work. Sanders' story becomes a guide, teaching that true greatness is not defined solely by records, accolades, or public praise, but by the integrity and wisdom with which one navigates life's pressures. And yet, the tragedy persists. Even at 57, his story is framed by what he did not do, rather than the extraordinary life he chose to lead. The narrative of missing out, of unclaimed records, of what might have been, continues to color public perception. The world applauds his brilliance, but struggles to grasp the depth of his restraint. That is the paradox at the heart of Sanders' life. He walked away at the pinnacle, saving himself, yet was misunderstood for doing so. His brilliance is celebrated, but his wisdom often overlooked. At 57, Barry Sanders remains a man who embodies both triumph and tragedy. He is remembered for athletic feats that continue to awe, yet his most enduring legacy may lie in the courage to step away, the insight to recognize personal limits, and the ability to endure misunderstanding with grace. His story is a meditation on greatness, sacrifice, and the human condition, a reminder that the most profound victories are not always public, and the most lasting triumphs are often invisible. Barry Sanders' life teaches that true courage is measured not only by achievement, but by the wisdom to know when to leave, the foresight to protect one's own well-being, and the strength to live with the consequences, however misunderstood. The tragedy, then, is not simply that he left the game. It is that the world may never fully comprehend what he chose to save. And yet, in that choice lies the quiet dignity, resilience, and integrity that define him still, decades after the stadium lights have dimmed and the cheers have faded into memory.